Thank you, everyone, for coming to this breakout session. I'm Breeann McCusker. I'm the economic chief at the U.S. Embassy here in Doha. I help Ambassador Timmy Davis implement U.S. economic policy. I've been here over a year, 18 years as a U.S. diplomat. Really honored to be here and excited to learn more about climate and water financing and sustainable water projects in the Gulf. I don't know everything about the topic, but I do know that the significance of water security in U.S. foreign policy and national security goals is coming into sharper focus in the United States. And the U.S. is pursuing a whole-of-government approach to mobilize U.S. departments and agencies around concrete actions to promote a water-secure world. We understand there's an estimated annual financing gap of $1 trillion to achieve global water security by 2030 per the UN SDG 6. And that's why the United States is committed to collaborating with the private sector and other partners, such as banks and credit agencies, to catalyze new water and sanitation investments for large and small infrastructure projects, maintenance, and quality control. Since June 2022, when the White House Action Plan on Global Water Security was launched, the United States, through USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, has mobilized around $142 million in new finance for water security and sanitation. And that figure was from March of this year. So no doubt we've exceeded $142 million in new financing since then. And the National Alliance for Water Innovation, or NAWI, which is a Department of Energy-funded energy water desalination hub in California, headquartered at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. It focuses on fit-for-purpose water reuse technologies related to desalination. And NAWI recently announced $5 million in awards for pilot-scale technologies, $10 million in technological innovations that address challenges associated with pretreatment and concentrate management and desalination of brackish and wastewater as source water. Also, the Department of Energy's Water Power Technologies Office will release several funding opportunities in the near future, totaling more than $55 million to support research, development, commercial activities that advance the development of reliable, cost-competitive energy technologies and reduce barriers to technology development. And we, as the United States government, are committed to working with stakeholders through the U.S. International Trade Administration as well to highlight the role of the private sector, including U.S. firms' innovation in the water and wastewater sectors. We know that public-private partnerships are critical to success. Again, I'm delighted to be here and learn from Mr. Rickards and Mr. Eckardt and other session participants. So I'd like to turn first to Mr. Rickards to introduce himself and speak a little bit, if you would, about how public-private partnerships like the Qatar Water Exchange contribute to innovative financing models for sustainable water projects in the Gulf. If you could tell us, what are the key success factors and challenges associated with such partnerships?
Sure. Thank you, Bree. So I'm Scott Rickards. I'm the CEO of a company called Water Fund, which was actually formed about 12 years ago out of a hedge fund and alternative asset management initiative in Dubai, which was initially focused on commodity investing. So some major US firms like BlackRock and others were involved here in commodity asset management. There was a portfolio that did extremely well, and at one point, the profits from that portfolio was to be invested in water. So I got into water in the first place from the alternative asset management industry, and I've been investing in water, nothing but water assets over the last 12 years. So it's been an interesting journey going from a traditional kind of finance background to really being deeply involved in the water sector. The way I approached it initially was, water's really not well understood by Wall Street. Just in general, if you think about it, let's say you're a customer of BlackRock, for example, and you want to allocate $100,000 into water. How do you do that? Or what are your options for doing that? And I don't think there's a good framework even today as to how someone could go about thinking about that. So the way I always approached water was from an investor's point of view. And I think that's, one of the difficulties over the years has been discussing the topic of money and water at the same time, mostly because there's a fear, and a fear that I think we have to start understanding a little better, that by private investors getting involved in water, there's the risk that water becomes less accessible or it becomes more expensive. So part of what I've done over the last 12 years is try to address that issue. But with respect to P3s, public-private partnerships are not particularly new. They've been around since the early 1980s in water. They take many different forms, and I think P3s have been extremely effective. I think that the current project here in Qatar that Bernd will get into in a second is a really great example of an effective P3 in bringing different stakeholders together. The whole purpose of a P3 obviously is to take the efficiencies of the private sector and impart those on the public sector entity sponsoring the project. My biggest issue, I guess, with P3s is the revenue model for the private partner doesn't always align as well as it should with the investors in the project. So if you think about it, you're a private company, you're delivering water services to a public agency. What's your formula for, what's your contract formula? It's the average cost of construction, it's your operating cost, and it's a profit margin. And that's really your revenue source from the public entity. The issue from a financial point of view that I have with that is there's no built-in incentive to actually to cut cost. And that a P3 is supposed to become a more efficient model than a traditional public sector utility model, but it doesn't always live up to that. And I think part of the issue is there's no, the formula, the contract formula, the revenue part doesn't always make perfect sense. So that's that'd be my main critique of the P3 model. I think there's solutions to that. One of the solutions is on the investor side, if there's some sort of additional return that or a cost to the service provider, I think that would if the project goes over budget, if costs become too high, there should be something built in that enables that keeps those theoretical efficiencies in place. So my issue with P3s is it just hasn't gone far enough. I think they're great as far as they go, but they don't go far enough to really get your average investor excited about water. I think there's just not enough, and it's not that there isn't enough financial return or there isn't enough money. The issue is there's not a delivery mechanism that's easy to understand that allows your average investor to really participate in water. So what I'm focused on is really how to achieve that. In Qatar, we've just launched something called the Qatar water exchange, and my firm is a part of that. And the purpose of the exchange is really to develop those types of financial products. So Bernd knows a lot more about P3s at the at the project level. I'll let him get into that.
Sure, that's a great segue to Mr. Eckardt, who's the general manager of Wakra Water Contracting Company. Mr. Eckardt, the shareholders of Wakra Water Contracting Company have been involved in various water projects in the GCC. Specifically, there is a wastewater treatment plant project here in Qatar. Could you speak more about these projects and the innovative financing mechanisms employed in the project in Qatar?
Sure. Thank you, Breeann. Unlike Scott, I'm not coming from the financing side, I'm coming from the project execution side. So I'm coming into the picture when Scott is basically walking away. So he's securing the financing, and once the financial close is established, then I come in and try to deliver the project. So I've been here in the Middle East for more than 20 years, and I have been through 5 wastewater treatment plant projects of larger scales. Total combined capacity is around 950,000 cubic meter per day, so that's equivalent to almost 4 million people of generating wastewater every day. So I want to talk a little bit about the wastewater treatment plant project, but before that, let me just speak briefly about our shareholders in this company. So the Wakra Water Contracting Company has 3 shareholders. The first one is the Al Attiyah Motors and Trading Company. Some of the people here who residing here in Qatar probably know AMTC. AMTC has been established more than 40 years ago, and they have multiple businesses in the construction sector. One of the companies they are dealing with is voltage engineering, for example. This is a civil, mechanical, electrical company with more than 1,000 staff, and they have completed more than 300 projects here in Qatar. AMTC also is a sole distributor for a few construction equipment companies and truck companies and commercial vehicle companies here in Qatar. So they're very established here in the construction sector. The second shareholder of my company is Metito from the UAE. Metito is a provider of water and wastewater solution management solutions. They're also the lead developer in the project that I will talk about later on. Metito has executed privately financed large-scale water and wastewater treatment plants all over the world with a focus in the Middle East, Asia, and Europe. Their projects have a total development investment of more than $2 billion. I think they have been awarded recently in the UAE a very big contract with the ADNOC from Abu Dhabi, and I think the total investment is more than $2.2 billion. So they have done some other very prominent projects. For example, in Egypt, they have done the new Delta Agricultural Wastewater Treatment Plant with a capacity of 7.5 million cubic meter per day. That's one of the largest, I think this is the largest wastewater treatment plant that I know of in the world. And the water is being used for irrigation of an area of 1.2 million acres, which is approximately 70 by 70 kilometers of irrigated land. So it's quite substantial. They have also been involved in several other projects here on a BOOT basis, build, operation, own, transfer basis, here in the Middle East. One is, for example, the Dammam sewage treatment plant with a capacity of 200,000 cubic meter per day. They have worked on a desalination plant for NEOM. I think everybody knows about NEOM in Saudi Arabia. So they have provided their desalination plant with a capacity of 125,000 cubic meter per day. And interesting is that 25% of the electricity that is required to operate the plant is actually generated by solar energy. So that's quite unique as well in the region. The third shareholder of my company is Gulf Investment Corporation, also known as GIC from Kuwait. GIC is owned by the governments of the 6 member states of the Gulf Cooperation Council. They're acting as a private investor here in the region. And they are shareholders of many, many project companies like the one that I'm running. They have a few projects in KSA, for example, the Jubail Water and Power Project. There's a desalination plant with a capacity of 800,000 cubic meter per day. Just to give you an idea, if you consume water, you pretty much consume 150 liter per capita per day. So we're talking about 800,000 cubic meter per day. This is really a big plant. The capacity of the power plant there is 2.75 gigawatt. I think at that time in 2010, it was the largest plant in the world, if I remember correctly. They're also involved in the Shukake water and power project with a desalination plant with a capacity of 212,000 cubic meter per day, and a power plant with a capacity of 950 megawatt. So this project is delivered under the so-called build, operation, own basis with an operating period of 20 years. In Bahrain, they have just finished a project. It's called the Al-Dur Power and Water Project. GIC is a shareholder of the project company with 20% of the shares. The capacity of that plant is 218,000 cubic meter per day, and the capacity of the power plant is 1.24 gigawatt. So these are really big assets. This is really big water infrastructure. Now, coming to the Al Wakra and Al Wukair sewage treatment plant, which Bree and Scott already mentioned, the three shareholders have established a project company called Al Wakra Water Contracting Company. I'm leading that company. We're a very lean organization. We are a developer. We have only a handful of people, right? But we are appointing an EPC contractor, an O&M company, to deliver this project. That EPC contractor will provide around 3,000 staff at peak time for this construction. So Ashghal has signed a public-private partnership agreement. It's called PPPA with a project company to finance, design, construct, commission, and operate the sewage treatment plant. The project is fully in line with Qatar Vision 2030 to encourage the use of unconventional water resources for various applications like irrigation, industrial purposes, artificial recharge of groundwater, etc. This is the first PPP project in Qatar for a sewage treatment plant. The purpose of the project is to meet the future population and urban expansion needs in the Al Wakra and Al Wukair area. It is to provide modern water infrastructure for the communities. The project is located approximately 30 kilometers south of the center of Doha. The entire wastewater scheme is divided into three parts. The first part is the transport of raw sewage to the sewage treatment plant, which is not part of our project. The second part is the sewage treatment plant itself with a capacity of 150,000 cubic meter per day. This is part of our project. And the third part is the transmission of treated effluent. So the wastewater that is being treated in our wastewater treatment plant will be transferred to other locations in Doha for irrigation purposes or any other application. So in our case, the raw sewage will be collected in so-called catchment areas, and then it is being transferred into the tunnel and being delivered to our wastewater treatment plant. That tunnel is about 13.3 kilometers long and has a diameter of 4.5 meter. So this is, I don't know how high this is, but you can imagine if you just look at the ceiling here, how big that tunnel is. The end point of the tunnel is at a depth of 50 meters. So the tunnel comes in 50 meters under the ground, and then the raw sewage is being pumped into our plant. Our STP has a capacity of 150,000 cubic meter per day. In other words, this is roughly an equivalent of 550,000 people of generating wastewater every day. The construction of our STP will be completed in 2026, and after the completion of the construction, we will enter into the operation period, which is 25 years from the date when the plant reaches commercial operation. So, as I said before, the treated effluent is pumped from our plant roughly 13, 14 kilometers into other areas, and it's being used for the time being for irrigation purposes, but we have also a provision in our contract to drill deep injection wells so we can pump 50,000 cubic meter per day into the aquifer for artificial recharge if there is no demand on the irrigation side. Regarding the project financing, so we are slightly different of what Scott is doing. We do big financing, right? So we're not looking into crowd financing, things like that you may look into.
Yeah, just because I'm not talking about crowd financing as well.
Crowdfunding.
I'm talking about institutional financing, but having that institutional financing appeal to your average or be understood by your average investor. So that's what I mean.
Yeah.
But water's a big numbers game.
Yes. So our project financing is financed by a mix of equity and debt. And the equity is injected by our 3 sponsors first. And then once that equity is exhausted in the project, we will start using the debt that is financed by lenders. And these lenders are regional lenders or international lenders from the market. In total, we have in our project 6 lenders that are securing the debt financing of the project. We're using innovative financing. Unfortunately, I have an NDA, so I can't really talk much about it at this point. But what I can say is that we're using mini permanent financing and a few other innovative methods. Mini permanent financing is often used when developers have a project that doesn't start generating revenues quickly. So we have a extended construction period of 3-4 years. And after that, when the commercial operation date is achieved and we run into the operation period, this is when we start generating revenues, not before that. So the debt is structured as a mini perm where the debt is refinanced a number of times over the concession period. So basically, we don't have a long refinancing period. We have 3 or 4 interim refinancing period where we pay the full debt back to the lenders, and then we start refinancing again. So that's a brief about the project from my side.
Really, really helpful and really interesting details. We don't always think about wastewater and raw sewage and what happens to it, but this is a really important piece of what we're talking about today. One thing that I'd like to dig down a little more on is the private sector investments for scaling up water infrastructure projects. And so this could be for either of you. Curious about the incentives that are necessary to attract private investors to water initiatives in the Gulf in particular, and risks that are involved in that as well, and how governments can facilitate a conducive environment for private sector participation while ensuring the public's interests are still safeguarded. Who would like to? Yeah, Scott.
I'll start. Is that how it goes?
Talk about risk.
Yeah. I think it's worth taking sort of the 30,000-foot view of water. There are a couple important statistics that were mentioned on other panels that bear repeating. One of them is the global water market in 2023 will be approximately a $225 billion business, basically. So that's how much. That's really the value of global industrial water, municipal water. The entire water market is about that amount. You compare that amount with the market cap of, say, ExxonMobil. Today, it's about a $900 billion company listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So a single energy company is a 3 times plus multiple of the entire global water industry. And water is pretty critical. I think we'll all agree to that. So why is there? And then the other big number is there are 3 billion people in the world that don't have access to a reliable water supply. So 225 sounds big, but it's really nothing compared to what it needs to be to adequately serve the 3 billion additional people. So what are the obstacles to that? And it's primarily financial. Water is an extremely attractive asset class, mostly because it has long-term contracted cash flows. So Bernd's project here in Qatar is, I'm sure Bernd doesn't think it's an easy project, but from an investor's point of view, there's many banks, many investors would line up outside the door of Bernd's project here in Qatar because it will have long-term contracted cash flows from a highly creditworthy government entity. So that's an easy one from a financial point of view. What's much harder is when you have a village level water project, a small city, somewhere in India, Africa, North Africa. How do you finance that, and how can that small city or village access capital to build water supply capacity? And that's not. There hasn't been a good answer to that question apart from, say, World Bank or multilateral institutional financing. There's not really. There aren't a lot of pockets to turn to when you're in that position. So I think one of the innovations that's needed and has yet to be developed but could be developed is to really bundle those types of opportunities into a more creditworthy entity that could be financed by a bank or by a larger institution. So I think that's partially what my firm does, and what we're focused on is trying to take a number of those smaller opportunities, put them into a larger one, and then make it more digestible for financial investors in Europe and in the US that have significant appetite for water. I mean, there's enormous appetite, especially in today's world of high inflation. Water is an inflation-adjusted real asset that should be in everyone's portfolio. It turns out it's not really in anyone's portfolio, and the question I always ask myself is why such a gap? Such a relatively simple to understand asset class is sort of absent from the Wall Street mix of financial products, and I think it mostly has to do with a fear that if we do this to water, if we build water into some sort of financial product, that it will create some kind of obstacle to supplying it or to paying for it. And I just think it's a misconception. I think with capital, there's so much more that can be done in water. There's amazing technology out there. There's there's a willingness. I think there's a willingness from at sort of the small city or village level of customers to pay for water that may not be fully understood. I worked on a water project in southern Peru. We acquired a distribution asset for water in southern Peru that was completely destroyed about 2 weeks later from a 7.9 earthquake. And I went down there just to see what had happened. And I was very surprised to see that without any water supply at all, and with the asset having basically been demolished by an earthquake, everyone in the village was still paying their water bill on time. They were lined up to pay because when the system came back online, they wanted water. You can't live without water. So I think there's, provided additional supply of water, there are many more customers out there that would happily line up and pay for water if only given the opportunity to tap into a sophisticated 21st century water network. So point being, there needs to be more innovation in products that reach a much larger audience, because by doing that, water can become the ExxonMobil, and it doesn't have to stay sort of in the backwater that it is in terms of the world of finance. There's a lot of innovation that could bring more capital into the sector.
If I may, I'll take that as an example. The earthquake, for example, that is a huge risk, right? And that is something that you don't want to have in your project, but it can come. So for most investors, the market is attractive if you have a fast-growing environment, if you have a predictable market, right? If you have a high level of returns, right? But project-specific risk can diminish everything like that. And when you look at the risk, for example, you're having a risk like it starts with land availability, it starts with site access, it starts with design, you have construction risk, you have risk of variations, you have risk of the operation or disruptive technology. Say, for example, you take a project on board, an RO plant, and you get your membranes for the desalination plants from a vendor, and in 15 years the vendor is gone, he's not in the market anymore. You have a big problem in the project. So all of these risks need to be carefully assessed, and this is something from my experience that is not done properly here, because everybody always sees the dollars in their eyes, but they don't really see the risk associated with that, right? And this is something that I think at the beginning of a project, when you define the project, somebody needs to develop a risk matrix, right? Outlining what are the risks and who is responsible for taking the risk. PPPA is a big risk transfer from a contracting authority to a private investor. That's what it is. And in that project, there's an EPC contractor, there's a developer, there's an O&M company, there are many, many other stakeholders, and everybody needs to know exactly what the risk is. I was at a symposium 2 or 3 years ago, and somebody from the contracting authority from Kuwait was saying that if you don't like the heat, don't go into the kitchen, right? And that is not really the right attitude when you do PPPs, because at the end of the day, there's one very, very important word, and that's partnership. And I have seen this so often in the market that I'm active in, that the word partnership is not really lived by the partners. It is more like, here's your contract, here's your baby, this is what you have for the next 25, 30 years, and that's it, right? And I feel sometimes that, a share of risk and then the awareness of risk and how we can work on the risk together is sometimes that the partners are not doing very well.
We had a very good insurance policy. And the Peru example,
Was it a force majeure? No.
It was, and we...
It was a force majeure?
We actually... I think we quadrupled the investment 2 weeks in as a result of the earthquake, which enabled us to rebuild the entire water utility, and it's worth $400 or $500 million today. And it was essentially in bankruptcy after the earthquake. So.
Force majeure is a good topic. Like, who would have thought we would have a pandemic, right? I have not seen anybody in the last 20 years before the pandemic actually occurred that somebody has allowed any provisions in their budget for that. Not at all. It was zero. So everybody who was hit by the pandemic as a contractor really suffered a lot. Not only the contractor, everybody suffered, of course, but some contractors just went down the river and couldn't keep the business anymore simply because of that. They didn't have the right insurances.
Yeah. Yeah. And if we hadn't been in that situation, if we hadn't been the investor in that case, there would have been no insurance policy and the network would never have been rebuilt.
Shift a little bit to leveraging new technologies and data-driven solutions. And I won't ask you to talk about AI and how that could change things, and drawing a moat around critical infrastructure, and that could be a whole different conference topic. But about innovative financing that uses or leverages new technologies and data-driven solutions. How can these new technologies be used to optimize water resource management and attract investments in water infrastructure projects? I feel like, Scott, you're nodding, so I'm turning to you.
Because the first thing I did when I started Waterfund is we partnered with IBM to build a software platform, an analytics platform for the cost of water. So we built an entire sort of analytics platform, cost-benefit analysis around the production cost of water. It was an interesting exercise because if you think about it, what does it cost to produce water in Doha versus New York City versus Singapore? And why does it differ? And understanding that question was an interesting question. And it gets to the heart of how to potentially supply more capital to the water industry. So in terms of just my experience at Waterfund, it was a really eye-opening exercise to see that cost of water in let's say in Riyadh is about $9 or $10 per cubic meter. In Singapore, it's about $2.50. In New York City, it's about 20 cents per cubic meter. And understanding why that's the case can really help inform financial decision-making. It can also form the basis of financial products. So once you have an index, I mentioned insurance, the most innovative type of insurance policy in the world today at the corporate level is index-linked insurance. And so we developed a product where the payout of the insurance policy was determined by the value of this particular index, which we call the water cost index. So that's one innovation. And IBM was key to that because their software enabled us to gather data. This was before AI was a thing, but we were using, I guess more traditional data analytics to actually read financial statements without having to have a team of analysts. So, the IBM, Watson or whatever it was at the time was able to actually read financial statements from hundreds of different water companies and understand what their cost of water was. So that was an interesting, that's one way you can apply something that sort of resembles AI, I guess, to the water problem.
Oh, that's really interesting, and I'm sure that will continue developing over the coming years. Bernd, let's see. Could I ask you to speak a little more about collaboration between public and private sectors and best practices, maybe lessons learned on successful collaborations between governmental bodies and private enterprises in the Gulf region in particular, and how can collaborations like these be replicated or scaled up to address the growing water security challenges effectively?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with explaining how complex these projects are, the PPP projects, when it comes to large-scale water infrastructure. So in the project here, for example, in Doha, we have the off-taker, Ashghal. Ashghal has a legal, technical, financial advisor. Then we have the project company. The project company has 3 shareholders. The shareholders have a legal, technical, financial advisors. My company has a legal, technical, financial advisor. Then I have an EPC contractor who's actually building the plant. That EPC contractor is a JV of 3 companies. All companies have their advisors and their design companies. And then we have an O&M company that will have the same. And we have on top the lenders who also have technical advisors. So I have counted roughly, I think we're getting to something between 40 and 50 key stakeholder or primary stakeholder and secondary stakeholders. And most of these stakeholders also have agreements with each other. Written agreements, which are, again, written by lawyers, right? So you can see collaboration is a big thing, and it is very important. And I have found 2 models. I've seen 2 models here. One model is where, for example, the contracting authority is also putting equity into the project company, all right? They may have different motivations for that. Maybe they want to be part of the day-to-day operations. Maybe they want to be part of the revenues and the profit that the company is making. There are different motivations for that. Some other contracting authorities don't want to do that. They want to stay out of this. They said, no, we want to have a professional developer that develops. I want to have my peace of mind. And, you hand over the plan back to me in 25 years. So you can see it is very, very complex, and collaboration is key. There are pros and cons for these different models. Say, for example, contracting authority from a public authority is putting equity into the project company. You will probably find it easier to get permits in that country. You need a lot of construction permits, right? There are like 10, 20 permits that you need. You need to renew them. It is much easier if the contractor is, the project company has a partner that is basically at the same time the off-taker. Right, but then on the other side, you have models where the contracting authority doesn't want to be part of the project company, and in this case, the project company and the developers, they actually favor that because they don't want to hand over or they don't want to leak any technology intelligence to the authority, which they may use in the future. So it is really difficult at the beginning to define what is the best model. But as you can see, when you go for a PPP project and you see the complexity of it, collaboration among the parties is absolutely key for the success of the project.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Scott, would you want to add anything on that?
Well, I just have a question, Bernd. I mean, are you seeing any additional difficulty with sort of the climate bonds and green bonds market in obtaining, certifications, or are there any additional, or how much of a burden does
not on the financing side
the green bonds market put on something like your
not
your
on the financing side? No, we have not seen that. No.
Okay.
I'm as an executor, I'm more concerned that I don't get my environmental permit to start construction works. This is my big problem. And if then the environmental authority says, no, you have to send us this letter and that letter, and they're very different forms, and I have a delay all of a sudden of 2 or 3 months in the project because I can't secure that permit for bureaucratic reasons, then I have a problem, right? And that is a risk that the lenders, the project company, and the EPC contractor have to take. So this is what I said. If you have a better collaboration than with the contracting authority, things can be much smoother.
Well, making these projects environmentally friendly is certainly a key goal. I'm curious, Scott, if you could tell us a little bit more about green financing and sustainable bonds as emerging trends in the financial sector, and how can these financial instruments be utilized to fund environmentally friendly water projects? What impact could they have on promoting water security and environmental sustainability in this region?
Well, I mean, first of all, the green bonds, climate bonds market is about $300 billion a year. So just the size of the market today is approximately that. Water represents 10 to 15% of that 300 billion. So you could call it blue bonds. We like to call it blue bonds. I think it's a nice name and label to give that slice of the climate bonds market, and I think it really should be marketed that way to investors. I don't think anyone really uses the term blue bonds except when it comes to sort of ocean, protecting oceans and that type of thing that Raha would know more about than I would. But I think so that's the market. And then as far as it pertains to what can the green bonds market do to transform the delivery and the technologies that are used in water? I think the most interesting application that I've seen that's relevant to water and desalination in particular is actually the brine discharge that you get from desalination plants is a big issue when you're building a desalination plant. And I think the latest requirement for a water desalination plant to be certified as a green bond is to deal with that issue. And I think Qatar has put it on its list of priorities in terms of project delivery. So that's just one I think important example of the kind of issue that the green bonds market can bring to water and the kind of technologies that could potentially benefit from that market. I guess I think the other question is, and that's why I asked Bernd, how relevant is green bonds to what you're doing? And it sounds like at least at this level here in Qatar, because I've heard from other projects in Qatar that there are additional requirements, which is probably a good thing for most of these projects. But a wastewater treatment plant is pretty environmentally friendly by definition. So I don't think your project isn't the type of project that would have to explain itself.
But lenders really look carefully into the social impacts, the environmental impacts, welfare of workers, et cetera, et cetera. So this has become more and more important over the course of the last few years. I remember when I did the first project, that was in 2006. I think there was just like, okay, let's stick to the Equator principles, right? And I would say we didn't meet them fully, but it just went ahead. There's no way a project would be financed nowadays with the same conditions. No way. So, and then this is a good thing. I think this is a really good thing.
Also, every major investment bank now has a climate bonds team. So there's a dedicated team at you name the big bank, and there's a desk there that does nothing but focus on certification and issuance. So it's a massive and growing market. I think water should do a better job of standing out in that market because it's not really the first thing people think of when they think of green bonds and climate bonds. So one of the goals of what Water Fund's doing and what the Qatar Water Exchange is doing is to focus on the blue bonds segment of that market.
interested in hearing more about blue bonds, but it sounds like Dr. Raha is better placed to talk about those. I'm curious if you, since you're coming from different backgrounds, experiences, and perspectives, I'm curious if you have any questions for each other. I'm really enjoying the back and forth, between the large, government.
Any investment opportunities in the Wakra project? But sounds like that's taken care of. So
Indeed, we're all interested in that.
That I observed, and I'm not going into politics, so don't get me wrong, but there was I think the Republicans had their round of discussions with their nominees or with their candidates, and I was watching this, and it was all about power, electricity, Not a single word about water. Not a single word about water. And I couldn't understand that, because at the end of the day, we can live without electricity. We can't live without water. We can't. So I think that really we need to change the dynamics a little bit in political discussions, and we need to overemphasize the importance of water and the importance of reusing water like we do, right? I mean, that was something that 20 years ago wasn't the case. Now, every public utility has in its agenda to use 100% of their treated effluent, and this is the way to go. But again, when you look at policymakers, politicians, not a single word about.
Well, I think Malcolm actually said it best, this morning when he said, "Really hits home when it hits your pocketbook." And he mentioned Florida. Florida is a great example because it's so important to U.S. politics. It's so it is probably going to be the fastest growing desalination market in the world, partially because there's so much salt intrusion, and Florida is really a below sea level swamp. so I think it's going to be an interesting case for water, because if it happens in the U.S. that the profile of water really increases, I think the state of Florida will actually be the center of that, and California to some extent as well.
Indeed. I mean, though it's not the most exciting topic for political or especially presidential debates, I do believe the U.S. has realized that investments in water and sanitation safeguard our public health and our economic growth, because we need to be able to respond to climate change, natural disasters, prevent conflicts, reduce famine, and create jobs, both in the U.S. and abroad. And I do know that the U.S. Global Water Strategy intends to mobilize an additional $1 billion in non-U.S. government funds for global water security and sanitation. That's especially through U.S. aid, partnerships and investments. And we're looking at a $100 million loan from the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, the DFC, to Water Equity's Global Access Fund 4. That's an impact investment fund that leverages public and private resources to support climate-resilient water and sanitation infrastructure where it's needed most. And in my opening remarks, I mentioned the U.S. International Trade Administration's role, including with the private sector, to promote U.S. firms' innovation in the water and wastewater sectors. So I know it's not the sexiest topic to talk about, in political forums, but I do think that the United States, at least, is doing a lot on that level and looking to do more in the coming years. I think it's time for us to open up to questions. So I don't have one of those tablets that shows me, the QR code questions here in the breakout session. So I'll just look to you if anyone has a question for me. Natasha.
Hi, thank you. Really, really interesting. Fascinated by the pricing of water and wastewater treatment. Scott, could you talk a bit more about these bundling opportunities that you were talking about? Because a big issue is obviously cost recovery. Water is very cheap in many, many countries, or free, which is part of the reason we're having a lot of these issues. So I'm wondering, when you do bundle those, maybe you aren't far enough along to speak to this, but Could you speak to some examples of how this actually works, or is there ever cost recovery from those, I guess I'll call them weaker markets, or markets where the return on investment wouldn't necessarily be there?
Yeah, good question. The bundling is actually already, that's done by multilateral banks already. So that's the common way, like I said, at the village level, that project finance is obtained by taking multiple smaller scale water networks and sort of bringing them together so that you have more significant cash flows that can then be financed. So in the case of a zero water tariff, that's a more difficult issue. But I think most water tariffs sit below the cost of production. So in other words, water is subsidized pretty much everywhere. But there's enough, by bringing together multiple municipalities, there's enough creditworthiness behind that. Not necessarily cash flows, but there's creditworthiness that then enables you to finance a project like that. So the tariff issue can be overcome by just making the entire finance opportunity bigger. And that's common for development banks. It's not common yet for investment banks and for Wall Street. So that's sort of what I'm focused on, how to scale that up for smaller cities and other bigger opportunities. But it's a good point.
Any other questions? Jamie.
So I'm thinking about what was brought up in one of the earlier sessions today about, the sort of a circular water economy. And I'm wondering how that might intersect with financing. If the project is not, just the production of water or just the treatment of wastewater or getting water to an agricultural, sector. Is there an intersection? Is there something to say about this? Are there multiple revenue opportunities, perhaps, if we move to a more circular water economy?
Good question. That's a good question. The answer is yes, and it's being done. It's actually being tried at scale in Saudi Arabia right now with the minerals that can be extracted from the brine of desalination plants. That's a good example. So there is commercial scale lithium potentially, for example, in the brine that's the reject water of desalination plants. So that's one example. There are other minerals in the brine that could be valuable and could be extracted. What's another example?
Yeah, for example, on the wastewater side, right? We have a byproduct called sludge. So the sludge can be prepared in such a way that you can sell it later on to pellets and you can use it in the agricultural sector. TSE, treated sewage effluent, so the water that comes out of the wastewater treatment plant is being sold again, basically to industrial purposes or for irrigation or for whatever. So this market is already, I would say, is still in a premature stage, but that is certainly coming. So when you go the water flow, you start with desalination, you sell the water for the first time to consumers, and then the drinking water is converted into wastewater. It ends up at the sewage treatment plant. You're producing sludge, you're producing gas that can be reused for the electricity on the wastewater treatment plants itself, and then you have the treated sewage effluent that you can also sell to new markets. So that's possible, yes, and that is already in place in many cities, I would say, even here in the Middle East already.
Thank you, first of all. This was such an informative discussion. So I wanted to know that you guys are talking about financing models and technology when it comes to water infrastructure and water management infrastructure in general. But how important do you think it is to incorporate the voices of the local communities that are living around those areas where these infrastructure projects are being built, and whether their needs and their concerns are being met? Are there any examples related to the projects that you guys have worked on?
Well, what I can say is if we build large-scale water infrastructure, the communities are usually happy because they get safe water, or they get safe disposal of wastewater. So in our case, these large-scale projects are always in line with the governmental visions that they have, like Qatar Vision 2030. So it's very important that any infrastructure project is aligned with the visions, and these visions are usually very positive for the communities.
And I think the way I'd answer that is, when there's often an urgent water need at the more local, smaller scale level, and so we've done a lot of mobile desalination, basically, that can be deployed in modular form and can be deployed, on a moment's notice anywhere where there's a real water supply issue. So we've done that multiple times across the Middle East and other places. But part of your question was, what's the reaction in general at the village level to new water infrastructure? I think it's universally, positive. Like the case I mentioned in Peru, I think people were so focused on where their next drop of water was coming from that, they paid their water bill when there was absolutely no water being supplied. So I think any solutions that are on offer are generally welcomed.
To give you an example, when I started my career in Vietnam, and I was working as a water design engineer in the highlands of Vietnam. And it took us around 3 months from putting some lines on a piece of paper until the pipe was in place. And the most rewarding moment for me was always when I went to a house of some local people, and they just opened a tap and they had water 24/7. And that was so rewarding, and that's one saying. Universally, it is positive actually when you provide water or wastewater services.
Great, thank you. Any other questions?
I have a question in regards to the projects that are kind of unfinanceable. Say you have country X, sovereign rating below BBB, banks don't want to go there. There's no one in the international financial community that would finance that. A small village, sub-Saharan Africa. That niche, do you think it could be filled by something outside of maybe your sectors of expertise, but some kind of micro-lending, crowdfunding? Do you see a niche that could be filled by humanity, by someone?
Technology has a role to play. I think different kinds of technology obviously apply in different places. In Sub-Saharan Africa, what I've seen in those cases is very, very small modular water units that are self-sustaining, that are solar powered. It's sort of like a lot of innovations when they arrive in Africa, they skip a generation, and I think mobile water units are probably the best one of the best solutions for that type of problem right now. I mean, the finance issue, there's no way to get around the fact that it's difficult to finance. So I think that's where technology comes in and can play a role, because these units pay for themselves pretty quickly. So there is positive economic impact. They are financeable for that reason, and I think as it applies to Sub-Saharan Africa, that's an effective solution. It's not the ultimate solution, but it is the solution for the time being.
A good example, a U.S. example, in July 2022, the Millennium Challenge Corporation and the government of Timor-Leste signed a grant agreement dedicating $308 million to the water and sanitation project that included construction of a plant to produce chemical disinfectant for the city water supply, building the country's first central wastewater system, improving the drainage network for the capital city of Dili and 4 nearby municipalities, and promoting social and behavioral change to improve sanitation and water management at the household level. We also had the U.S. African Development Foundation supporting African agriculture cooperatives to improve food security and systems, increase incomes for smallholder farmers, and build resilience via climate-smart practices in underserved communities across Africa. So we have a lot of initiatives going to address your question, Jeff.
That are not commercially viable onto themselves. It's charity, essentially. Like DFC or USAID.
Yeah, but there are economic and national security reasons to promote the well-being of our partners in Africa.
We sponsored a WASH fund in Africa about 5 years ago, and it's actually been very financially successful, particularly on those units, because those units pay for themselves quickly. I mean, if you think about how much water it takes for a unit to pay for itself, it doesn't take that much. So that's been it's been not only effective, but it's been financially successful as well. It was initially more of a sort of a humanitarian charity endeavor, and it turned out that it was actually a profitable business opportunity. So
Promote stability abroad as well, which is in global, national interest. It's a good question, though.
Maybe for the audience, I'm not sure if you know, but the big CapEx, the capital expenditures are not necessarily in the treatment plants. They are in the pipelines and pumping stations. So a pipeline, a 60-kilometer long pipeline of, say, 2-meter diameter cross country costs much, much, much more than the desalination plant that is pumping the water into the pipeline. So this is another problem when financing infrastructure, because lenders have an interest in something that is easy for them to understand, like a wastewater treatment plant. They can generate revenues because they're selling either the TSE or they're getting paid for the treatment of wastewater. But a pipeline is a sort of a dead asset to them. It's more like a risk because they can't generate revenues for them. So for lenders, this is a highly unattractive piece of asset to finance. They're interested in treatment plants, but they're not necessarily interested in any peripheral water infrastructure, which actually costs much, much more than the actual treatment plants.
Right.
Yeah.
Why not look at like energy, where you have a purchase power agreement, a PPA, a PPP for energy, and you have the generation, the transmission, the distribution, you financially package it as one 30-year concession, or like your 25-year concession, and you build it all in together. And could they do that with water?
Yeah, they can do, but the lenders and developers are not very interested in that. You know, the more peripheral infrastructure you add to a project, the less the interest is.
Yeah, but that's where the innovation is needed, because that's a great idea, and there's no reason, you know, packaged properly and with the proper financial support, that couldn't make a lot of sense. So it's a good point.
Really good. Good thought-provoking questions. Do we have any more? All right. Then yes.
In former session, one of the audience said an interesting item that in some countries in the region they have not money to invest. You know, the question is not that how to invest or how to prioritize when we have not money. Do you know any solutions to how to find good finance for their water infrastructure? Thank you.
For uncreditworthy cities, municipalities around the world to access finance. But you have to focus, I think so much of the focus is on those in need of water, and there's less focus on those who are potentially investors in water. So my company is an investor in water. So I think about it with an investor hat on. I think most people look at water from sort of your point of view, which is the supply point of view. There needs to be a lot more work done on packaging water financially in a way that appeals to a much broader audience and easy to understand, well packaged. Think of the U.S. mortgage market. Think of the slicing and dicing and all the madness that went on in that market. If a fraction of that were applied to water, you could attract a lot more capital. And I gave the example of, ExxonMobil has a $900 billion market cap. The global water industry this year will be worth about $225 billion, all in, everything. So how do you multiply that? And the answer is you have to build innovative financial products that address what investors' concerns are when it comes to water. So inflation adjusted, capital protection, all these things are important to investors. And how do you design something that delivers that? And in doing that, there'll be, I think, abundant capital to fund smaller, medium-sized water projects around the world. But it's a lot of work that needs to be done to get there.
Any more questions?
Maybe a quick question.
Sure.
Are there investors that are interested in the way that the sector is operating in terms of give incentives for sustainability or a change in lower emissions or in that? Are there incentives like that?
I think that's actually where most of the interest lies. I mean, if you look at every major investment bank, there's a climate bonds team that issues billions of dollars of climate bonds at every major investment bank today, and about 15% of that is water focused. So the question is, how do you take that 15% up to something higher? And I think that's, those considerations are very critical, and I think that's the heart of the blue, what we would call the blue bonds market today.
If Scott, if you'd be willing to kind of give us your best guesstimate, strategically forecast 20 years out, we're at $225 billion today for the annual global water market. What would you say it would be in our lifetimes, towards the end of our lives, 20, 30, 40 years?
Fastest growing water market in the world today is India. I think the sub-Saharan African market, which is massive, has massive potential, still doesn't really register in terms of the capital flows. But if you just took India and achieved all the potential you could in building out infrastructure in that country, it easily becomes a $500 billion market. That's in a 5-year period, especially given inflation. I mean, if you think about the role inflation plays in potential returns on water assets, it's a big deal because every cash flow from every water tariff in the world is basically indexed to inflation. So that number can get big very, very quickly.
I have a question. Out of these, how much would you say is related to water and how much is wastewater?
In India or
no,
just in globally? Yeah, so wastewater is the fastest growing segment of the water treatment industry by far. So it's a good question. I don't have a number, but it's the fastest growing for sure. I mean, the fact that Qatar is now going to be treating wastewater is a big great example of how it's sort of catching on. Singapore was the original, and now it's growing.
Hi, a slightly different question. For wastewater management, how is the talent pool looking? Because in the United States, the generation that used to run the plants are now retiring, and there's a hard time finding younger workers to take those roles. How is that looking globally? Is there a talent pool out there to fill these roles, fill these jobs?
I think that's actually a really good point. There's definitely if you look at major universities, they don't churn out water engineers. So yeah, there's a gap. And in our water plants, we've experienced all kinds of issues in terms of trying to find experienced plant engineers and operators. There's I don't know, and Bernd has more sort of firsthand experience with that. But in my view, there needs to be a more sort of practical water focused program at major universities when it comes to water.
Yeah, I think if you do internships while you study, I think that would be extremely helpful. Put people on a wastewater treatment plant, put people into a desalination plant, explain to them how the transmission network works, how does how is the wastewater treated, what is the technology, I can't really say. I mean, I've not been in university for many years, but I thought when I studied there was no practical approach really. I just studied 4 years and then I went into my job and that's it, right? I can't really say how it is now, but surely, I mean, technology is so advanced now. We talked about artificial intelligence, right? Yeah. So there's so many sectors now that are coming together. And I can't really think that within 4 years of your study, you will capture this all. So I think, having a practical approach, do some internships in between would be very, very beneficial. Yeah.
Actually, Saudi Arabia has started their own water academy because for exactly that reason. There's not enough expertise. They're growing so quickly. They had to open their own school basically, which if you want to become a water engineer, it's probably the best school to go to. But it's the Harvard of water academies, I guess, in Riyadh.
Do you think that's healthy for us? Because I can't imagine grass.
I think there are traditionally some cultural barriers to use of wastewater.
For people, I think finish. Do you want to repeat it?
I think the question is about cultural barriers to use of wastewater.
So this is culturally a big thing, right? I was around 20 years ago when I was in Berlin, and I was at a wastewater treatment plant, and the operator came and gave me a glass of water and said, "You can drink that, no problem." And I was like, "No way, no way, no way." Right? And that was not a cultural thing. I went by science, right? And I was like, no. But I can see the cultural point here, right? And this is why it's so important to establish other markets where you can market the treated effluent, where you can sell it. Maybe not as drinking water. The technology is there. There's absolutely no doubt that we can treat the water to such extent that you can drink it without any problems. But I understand the cultural hesitance, right, in many areas around the world. But it's for us to establish markets where we can sell that water again and no drop of treated water is lost.
It could still be used for agriculture, right? I mean, even if you weren't drinking it.
My question, how it's healthy for us? Is there any study about that, or that's very healthy for people or not, or what?
I don't know about the health. I cannot say it makes you healthier. What I can say is it doesn't make you sick. So that's for sure. That's for sure. But I don't know. It's
after use it, nothing.
No. But I think it's the same. Like you drink water that comes out of a water bottle and has different taste. Because the minerals are different, and that's the same thing with the wastewater. Wastewater is not the same all over the world, right? If you, for example, have an industrial area connected to your wastewater treatment plant, you can still treat that water, but surely the minerals and everything contained in that treated effluent will be different than if you just take it from a residential area, right? So technology is there. It's all about marketing it.
Back.
You talked a lot about the potential of all these water projects. Where does any of the geopolitical kind of risk come into play? You have, let's say, Pakistan and India fighting for Kashmir because there's a lot of the water basins up there, where you have Jordan River Valley, problems in Turkey, building dams, water not going into Syria. So I'm just wondering, where does the geopolitical kind of risk come into the financing piece? How do you take that into account?
It's a hugely important consideration. I mean, Egypt is a good example. I think when two countries share a water, a water basin, there's whether it's groundwater or surface water, there's a conflict, right? So I think for owners of water rights, water rights is a very important part of the water market. That's kind of the foremost consideration. So if you want to own water resources, and I think about 10 years ago, this was a big trend among sovereigns, and in this region, owning water resources outside of national borders became a pretty important investment. It was high on the priority of investments, but how do you mitigate it, I guess is your question, or how when you own water assets that are potentially there's a potential conflict. You can buy insurance. So it's always one way to do it. There's a very deep liquid market in Lloyd's of London for all those types of bespoke insurance policies, and we use them in a lot of our projects. So that's one solution. But I think that the bigger issue is when two countries share a disputed water resource. There's no easy answer to that question. I think my answer to it would be, like Bernd said, when you're moving water, that's expensive. Water distribution's the most expensive part of the process. Water is heavier than oil. So how do you deal with that? Well, you treat water as locally as possible. So when I got into the water business, I had great ambitions to move water, and those ambitions faded pretty quickly once you realize the cost of moving water. So I think the solution is stay local, treat it at the source, and then you don't have to dispute anything because you leave the water resource alone.
That's really fascinating. I've learned a lot during this discussion as well. Do we have any last question? Any? Oh, yeah.
How do you see the capacity, not just of the governments, not just in the Gulf region, but in the general Arab region, of repairing bankable projects and being able to access these investments and investors?
Yeah, well, I think the GCC countries are deploying more advanced water technology than anywhere else in the world right now. So when it comes to advancing important technologies that can change the game in water, GCC is top of the list. It's 65% of the global desalination market. So, short answer is GCC is critical to advancing important new technologies in water. At the top of that list, I would put high recovery desalination. So if you can take seawater, today you take seawater and a desal plant transforms it into 50% fresh water. If you can take that up to 85%, which is definitely technologically and commercially possible, that's something that the GCC can absolutely lead the way on. So I think that's not only an important role, but probably a leadership role for the GCC in water finance and in water technology.
I think this is an important point because if you come with a new technology into this market, the authorities are risk adverse. They will ask you first, do a demonstration project, show it to us where you have done it, So I think there's it has changed a little bit over the years. I think the risk appetite of the authorities is a little bit higher now than it was maybe 10, 20 years ago. But still, if you want to enter the market with a new technology here, it's a long run. I would say anything between 2, 3, 4 years before you actually see your return on investment. Right? And a lot of companies, they don't have that stamina to go for 2 or 3 or 4 years. So this is still something where, coming back to, we talked about collaboration, where I think there is room for improvement.
I have the microphone, but I turned it off accidentally. Hello? Oh, is it working? Okay. Bernd, so you're in charge of Wakra. We're in phase 1, but there's going to be phase 2 and phase 3. Are you staying on personally to oversee everything?
I would love to.
Great news.
That was a short question.
And a short answer.
That's a little personal.
And a short answer.
Any last thoughts or last comments that you'd want to share with the group after the conversation, the discussion that we've had here this afternoon?
From my perspective, I've been here for so many years now, and I've always done large water infrastructure, and I'm really pleased to hear that there are businesses like what Scott is running now with different approaches, right? We didn't have that 10 years ago, and I think your market also, when I look at communities that are really in desperate need for water. I'm looking at Africa, I'm looking at maybe Asia. I think your business really will do very well there, and I think communities will benefit a lot from what you do.
Yeah, and I would just say, just to finish, I would say that we're in a macroeconomic environment where inflation's higher than it's been in 30 years. Venture capital has sort of gone out of favor. There's a lot of capital on the sidelines trying to figure out what to do in a very different environment than we were in just a few years ago. So it's water's moment to shine, I think, in terms of the financial opportunity and the potential capital that can come into the sector. So I would predict 2-3 years from now we'll have a multiple of where we are today in terms of the investment.
I like that quote. I wrote it down. It's water's moment to shine. I have to use that. Yeah.
And shine. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much for coming here today. It's a great conversation.